I should have known something was wrong when my son insisted I stay home that morning. Margaret had been complaining about her chest pains for 3 days. David told me he'd take her to the hospital himself, that I looked exhausted and needed rest. I was 62 years old, and after 40 years of marriage, I'd never missed a single one of Margaret's doctor appointments. But that morning, I was tired. I'd been working double shifts at the electrical supply company to help David with his debts, so I stayed home. I let him take her. That was 4 months ago. Margaret never came back. The doctors at St. Luke's Hospital in Phoenix said it was an allergic reaction, severe anaphylactic shock from a medication they'd given her for her heart condition. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the attending physician, explained it to me in that cold, sterile conference room. She used words I didn't understand: histamine cascade, vasodilation, cardiac arrest. All I heard was that my wife was dead, and they had given her something that killed her. David was there, his hand on my shoulder. I remember him asking the doctor questions, his voice sharp with anger. How could this happen? Why didn't they check her allergy records? Wasn't this medical negligence? Doctor. Rodriguez tried to explain about rare reactions, about how Margaret had never shown sensitivity to this class of drugs before, about how these things sometimes happen despite every precaution. But David wouldn't accept it. He kept pushing, kept demanding answers. After we left the hospital, David drove me home in silence. When we pulled into my driveway in Tempe, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. He said Mom deserved justice. He said we couldn't let the hospital get away with this. He said Dr. Rodriguez had been careless, that she'd missed something obvious in Mom's medical history. He had already contacted a medical malpractice attorney. He showed me articles on his phone about other cases, other families who'd sued hospitals for wrongful death. The settlements were in the millions. I didn't care about money. I just wanted Margaret back. But David said this wasn't about money. This was about accountability. This was about making sure no other family had to go through what we were going through. So I agreed. I signed the papers David brought me. I gave my statement to his attorney. I stood beside my son as he filed a lawsuit against St. Luke's Hospital and Dr. Elena Rodriguez. The funeral was on a Tuesday in late September. The Phoenix heat was brutal, even in the morning. Margaret had always hated the Arizona summers. She'd grown up in Oregon and never quite adjusted to the desert. I stood at her graveside, watching them lower her casket into the ground, and all I could think was that she'd be hot down there. It was a stupid thought, I know. The dead don't feel temperature, but grief makes you think crazy things. David gave the eulogy. He talked about Mom's kindness, her laugh, how she'd taught him to ride a bike in front of our old house on Elm Street. He talked about how she'd worked 2 jobs to help put him through college, how she'd always believed in him, even when his business ventures failed. He didn't mention the hospital during the service, but afterward, as people were leaving, I heard him talking to some of the mourners, telling them about the lawsuit, about Dr. Rodriguez's negligence, about how we were going to make sure this never happened to another family. Margaret's sister, my sister-in-law Claire, pulled me aside before she left. She lived in Seattle now, had flown down for the funeral. She asked me if I was sure about the lawsuit. She said Margaret had always spoken highly of her doctors, that she'd trusted them. I told Claire that David knew more about these things than I did. He worked in pharmaceuticals. He understood medications and dosages and medical protocols. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. Claire just nodded and hugged me goodbye. I haven't spoken to her since. The days after the funeral blurred together. I couldn't go back to work. I'd sit in the house Margaret and I had shared for 37 years, surrounded by her things. Her reading glasses on the coffee table, her coffee mug in the kitchen sink, her sweater hanging on the back of the bedroom door. David came by every few days, bringing groceries, checking on me. He'd sit with me and talk about the case. The attorney had filed all the paperwork. They were building their case against Dr. Rodriguez. Apparently, there had been other complaints about her. Nothing serious, David said, but it showed a pattern of carelessness. I asked if we could talk to Dr. Rodriguez directly, Maybe she could explain what happened in a way I could understand. David said that was a bad idea. Our attorney advised against any direct communication. It could compromise the case. Besides, David said, what would be the point? She'd just give us more medical jargon and excuses. She'd never admit she made a mistake. That's what doctors always do. They protect each other. So, I didn't reach out. I trusted my son. He was all I had left. 6 weeks after the funeral, David told me that Dr. Rodriguez had been suspended from the hospital, pending an internal investigation. He seemed satisfied by this news. He said it proved we were right, that the hospital knew they were liable. I asked him what would happen to Dr. Rodriguez's other patients. David said they'd be reassigned to competent doctors. Doctors who actually checked medical histories before prescribing medication. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake at night, replaying that morning, the morning I let David take Margaret to the hospital without me. I kept thinking about how scared she must have been, how alone. David said he'd stayed with her the whole time, but I should have been there. I was her husband. I'd promised to be there in sickness and in health, and when it mattered most, I'd stayed home because I was tired. The guilt was eating me alive. I started going through Margaret's things. I don't know why. Maybe I was looking for something. Some piece of her I could hold on to. I found old photo albums, letters we'd written to each other when I was stationed in Germany during my army days, her journal from the year we got married. I found her medical records too, all neatly organized in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. Margaret had always been meticulous about paperwork. Every doctor's visit, every prescription, every test result, all filed chronologically, with little notes in her handwriting. I spent hours reading through them. I didn't understand half of it, but I read anyway. I wanted to see what the doctors had missed, what Dr. Rodriguez had missed, but everything seemed thorough. Margaret's allergies were clearly documented. Penicillin, shellfish, latex. Nothing about the medication they'd given her at Street Luke's. David found me in the spare bedroom one evening, surrounded by papers. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was trying to understand. He sat down beside me and put his arm around my shoulders. He said I needed to stop torturing myself. The attorney had all of this. The medical experts had reviewed everything. I didn't need to understand the technical details. I just needed to trust that we were doing the right thing, but I couldn't let it go. Something was bothering me, scratching at the back of my mind. I started researching the medication online. I read medical journals and drug interaction databases. I didn't understand most of it, but I kept reading. Margaret had been taking several medications for her heart condition. Blood thinners, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors. I looked up every single one, and then I found something interesting. One of Margaret's regular medications had been changed about 3 months before she died. Same drug, different manufacturer. I found the documentation in her records. Her pharmacy had switched suppliers. It was a routine change, the kind that happens all the time. The pharmacist had called to inform her, and Margaret had noted it in her file. I called the pharmacy the next morning. I spoke to a woman named Janet who'd worked there for 15 years. She remembered Margaret. She said Margaret always came in on Tuesdays to pick up her prescriptions, like clockwork, always asked questions about her medications, wanted to understand what she was taking and why. Janet said she missed seeing Margaret come in. I asked Janet about the medication change. She pulled up the records and confirmed it. Same drug, different manufacturer. Margaret had been on the new formulation for 3 months without any problems. Janet said it was identical to what she'd been taking before, just made by a different company. There shouldn't have been any difference in how her body responded to it. Then I asked Janet about the day Margaret died. Had she filled any prescriptions that morning? Janet was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes, actually. David had come in early, around 7 a.m., before they'd gone to the hospital. He'd said Margaret was feeling worse and asked if there was anything they could give her over the counter to help with the chest pains until they could see the doctor. Janet had recommended some antacids and an over-the-counter pain reliever. Nothing that should have interacted with Margaret's other medications. David had never mentioned stopping at the pharmacy that morning. I thanked Janet and hung up. It was probably nothing. David had just been trying to help. He'd wanted to get something to ease Margaret's pain before the hospital visit. There was no reason he would have mentioned it. It wasn't important. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to look into David's finances. I know that sounds like a terrible thing for a father to do, but I needed to understand why the lawsuit had become so important to him. He kept talking about the settlement, about how much the case was worth. He'd mention specific numbers. 7 figures, he'd say. Maybe more if we could prove gross negligence. It seemed to matter to him more than it should. I knew David had money problems. He'd started his own consulting business 2 years ago, advising pharmaceutical companies on sales strategies. He'd borrowed money from Margaret and me to get it off the ground, $50,000. We'd given it willingly. We believed in him, but the business hadn't done as well as he'd hoped. He'd mentioned debts a few times, said he was working on getting things back on track. I'd offered to help more, but he'd said no. He was handling it. I accessed the joint bank account Margaret and I had shared. I'd been avoiding looking at it because every transaction reminded me she was gone. Her last purchase had been at the grocery store the day before she died. She'd bought ingredients to make my favorite dinner, pot roast with potatoes and carrots. I'd never gotten to eat it. I scrolled back through the transactions, and then I saw it. 3 months before Margaret died, David had deposited a check into our account. $25,000. The memo line said, "Life insurance advance." I stared at the screen, confused. What life insurance advance? Margaret and I had life insurance policies, but they were modest, $50,000 each. We'd had them for years. There was no reason for an advance. I called our insurance company the next morning. After being transferred 3 times, I finally spoke to an agent named Mr. Patel, who accessed our account. He confirmed we had 2 policies, each for $50,000. No recent changes, no advances, nothing unusual. I asked if it was possible someone had taken out an additional policy without my knowledge. Mr. Patel said that would be illegal unless I'd signed the paperwork myself. He asked if I wanted him to check if any applications had been submitted in my name. I said yes. He called me back 3 hours later. There had been an application, submitted 8 months ago, in April. A new policy on Margaret's life for $500,000, with me and David listed as co-beneficiaries. The application had my signature on it, but Mr. Patel said it looked different from the signature they had on file. He'd flagged it as potentially fraudulent, and the application had been denied. But then someone had resubmitted it. In June, this time the signature matched, and this time it had been approved. The policy had been active for 4 months, since 2 months before Margaret died. I hadn't signed any application for a $500,000 policy. I would have remembered that, unless I had signed something without realizing what it was. David had brought me a lot of paperwork over the past year. Papers for his business, tax documents, things he said I needed to sign as a co-signer or a witness. I'd signed them all without reading carefully. I'd trusted him. He was my son. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the phone in my hand, trying to understand what this meant. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe David had taken out the policy as some kind of investment strategy. He worked in finance and pharmaceuticals. Maybe this was normal in his industry. Maybe he'd told me about it and I'd forgotten. I'd been so tired lately. Grief does things to your memory. I needed to talk to someone who could help me make sense of this. Someone objective. But everyone I might have asked was gone or far away. Margaret's sister, Claire, lived across the country. My brother had died 5 years ago. Most of my friends were Margaret's friends too, and I hadn't been able to face them since the funeral. Then I remembered Janet from the pharmacy. She'd been kind on the phone. She'd known Margaret, and she worked with medications every day. She might be able to help me understand if there was any connection between the medication David had bought that morning and what happened at the hospital. I drove to the pharmacy the next afternoon. It was a small, independent place in an old strip mall on McDowell Road, the kind that was being squeezed out by the big chain stores. Margaret had loved it because everyone knew her by name. Janet was behind the counter, a woman in her early 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail. She recognized me immediately. She offered her condolences again, and we talked about Margaret for a few minutes. Then I asked her if we could speak privately. She led me to a small office in the back, away from the customers. I told her about the life insurance policy, about the signature that wasn't quite right, about how David had been managing so much of the paperwork in the months before Margaret died. I asked her if she thought I was crazy for being suspicious of my own son. Janet was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. She said, actually, she'd been hoping I would come back. She said she'd been thinking about Margaret's case ever since we'd talked on the phone. Something about it had been bothering her. So she'd pulled Margaret's prescription records and reviewed them carefully. She pulled out a file from her desk drawer. She said, "Look at this." She pointed to the record from the morning Margaret died. The over-the-counter medications David had purchased, the antacids and pain reliever. But then she showed me another record. From 3 days earlier, David had come in alone and purchased the same items, and he'd asked Janet specific questions about drug interactions. He'd wanted to know what would happen if someone took these over-the-counter medications with Margaret's prescription drugs. Janet had explained that at normal doses, there shouldn't be any problems. But David had asked what would happen at higher doses. What would the symptoms be? Janet said she'd thought it was odd at the time, but she'd figured David was just being cautious. He'd always been attentive when he came in with Margaret, always wanted to understand every medication she was taking. She'd thought he was being a good son, but now, looking back, his questions seemed different, more calculated. And there was something else. Janet pulled out another record. 2 weeks before Margaret died, David had come to the pharmacy alone. He'd asked to speak to Janet privately. He'd said his mother was having trouble sleeping and was experiencing anxiety about her heart condition. He wanted to know if there was anything that could help her relax. Janet had suggested some herbal supplements, melatonin, things like that. But David had asked about stronger options, prescription options. Janet had explained she couldn't prescribe medication, that Margaret would need to talk to her doctor. But then David had asked about something specific. He'd asked about a medication called diazepam. He'd said he'd heard it could help with anxiety. Janet had confirmed that yes, it was a sedative, but it required a prescription, and it could be dangerous when combined with other medications, especially heart medications like what Margaret was taking. David had thanked her and left. 2 days after that conversation, Margaret had gotten a new prescription. From a doctor Janet didn't recognize. A Dr. Chen at a clinic across town. For diazepam, Margaret had brought it in to be filled, and Janet had asked her about it. Margaret had seemed confused. She said David had taken her to see this Dr. Chen because she'd been so anxious. She didn't remember the appointment very well. She'd been exhausted that day. But the doctor had been very nice and had given her this prescription to help her sleep. Janet had filled it, but she'd been uncomfortable. She'd called Margaret's regular cardiologist to verify it was safe to combine diazepam with Margaret's other medications. The cardiologist's office had said they had no record of approving this additional medication. They'd said Margaret shouldn't be taking it without their supervision. But by the time Janet had called Margaret to warn her, it had been late in the evening. She'd left a voicemail. She didn't know if Margaret ever got it. I sat in that office, listening to Janet, and I felt like I was falling, like the ground had disappeared beneath me. Everything she was telling me pointed to the same impossible conclusion, but it couldn't be true. It couldn't be. David was my son. I'd raised him. I'd taught him right from wrong. He'd been at Margaret's bedside when she died. He'd cried at her funeral. He'd held my hand during the darkest days of my grief. He couldn't have done this. There had to be another explanation. But Janet wasn't finished. She said she'd done something she probably shouldn't have done. She'd looked into Dr. Chen, the doctor who'd prescribed the diazepam. The clinic address Margaret had given her didn't exist. The DEA number on the prescription was fake. Someone had forged the prescription, and Janet had a copy of it, with David's fingerprints all over it, because he'd been the one to bring it to the pharmacy when Margaret had been too tired to come herself. Janet said she'd almost called the police right then. But then Margaret had died, and she'd heard about the lawsuit against Dr. Rodriguez, and she hadn't known what to do. She didn't want to believe David had anything to do with it. But the more she thought about it, the more it all fit together. The questions about drug interactions, the forged prescription, the life insurance policy I'd just told her about. The timing of everything. She asked me if I wanted her to take this to the police. She said she had documentation of everything, prescription records, copies of conversations she'd logged in Margaret's file, the forged prescription. It was enough to start an investigation. But she wanted to check with me first, because David was my son, and she knew what this would do to me. I didn't know what to say. I sat there in that small office, looking at the papers spread across Janet's desk, and I couldn't breathe. Everything I thought I knew about my son was crumbling, but I still couldn't accept it, not without hearing it from him, not without giving him a chance to explain. I asked Janet if I could have copies of everything. She hesitated, but then she made copies for me. She put them in a manila envelope and handed it to me. She said if I decided to go to the police, she would support whatever I chose to do. And if I decided I needed time to think about it, she would understand. But she said, as a mother herself, she had to tell me the truth. The evidence was damning, and Dr. Rodriguez was innocent. She was about to lose her medical license for something she didn't do. I drove home in a daze. I don't remember the drive. I just remember sitting in my car in the driveway, staring at the envelope in my hands. Inside was evidence that my son had killed his mother, that he'd planned it, that he'd researched how to do it, that he'd forged prescriptions and manipulated medications and arranged for me to be gone that morning so I couldn't interfere, that he'd let an innocent doctor take the blame, that he'd convinced me to sue her, to destroy her career, to add one more victim to his list. And he'd done it all for money. $500,000 from a life insurance policy he'd tricked me into signing for. Money to pay off his debts. Money to fund his failing business. Money that was worth more to him than his mother's life. I sat in that car for 3 hours. The sun set. The street lights came on. My neighbors came home from work. The mailman delivered the mail. Life went on around me, normal and ordinary, while inside my car, I was falling apart. Finally, I went inside. I put the envelope on the kitchen table, and I called David. He answered on the second ring. He asked how I was doing. He said he'd been thinking about me, that he was planning to come by this weekend. He said the attorney wanted to schedule a deposition, that we needed to go over my testimony. His voice was warm and concerned and loving, the same voice that had comforted me at Margaret's funeral, the same voice that had promised me justice. I asked him to come over now, tonight. I said I needed to talk to him about something important. He said, of course, he'd be right there. He asked if everything was okay. I said we'd talk when he got here. He arrived 45 minutes later. He let himself in with his key, the way he'd been doing since Margaret died. He found me at the kitchen table, the manila envelope in front of me. He smiled when he saw me. He asked if I'd eaten dinner. He said he could order us some pizza if I was hungry. I pushed the envelope across the table toward him. I said I needed him to explain something to me. I needed him to tell me the truth about the life insurance policy, about the pharmacy visits, about Dr. Chen's prescription, about the questions he'd asked Janet, about why he was so insistent that we sue Dr. Rodriguez. David's smile faded. He sat down across from me. He asked where I got this information. I told him about Janet, about the prescription records, about the forged prescription with his fingerprints on it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he opened the envelope and looked through the papers. He took his time, reading each one carefully. When he was done, he set them down and looked at me. And he said yes, it was all true. He'd done it, all of it. He said he'd never meant for things to go this far. He'd been desperate. His business was failing. He owed money to the wrong people. People who'd made it clear what would happen if he didn't pay. He'd tried everything else. He'd borrowed from friends, maxed out his credit cards, sold everything he owned. But it wasn't enough. He needed more, a lot more. And Mom's life insurance was the only way. He said he'd researched it for months. He'd learned about drug interactions and how to make something look like an accident or medical error. He'd practiced forging prescriptions. He'd found a way to manipulate Mom into taking medications that would interact with her heart condition. He'd calculated the doses carefully, not enough to be obvious, just enough to cause a reaction that would look like the hospital's fault. He said he'd been planning to do it at home, but then Mom had started having chest pains naturally, and he'd seen an opportunity. If it happened at the hospital, It would be easier to blame the doctors. There would be more people involved, more potential for mistakes. It would be cleaner. So that morning, he'd made sure I stayed home. He'd given Mom an extra dose of the diazepam before they left, enough to make her confused and docile. At the hospital, he'd been with her the whole time. When the doctor ordered medication for her heart, he'd waited for the right moment. The nurses had been busy. He'd been trusted. He was her son. He'd added something to her IV himself, something that would trigger the reaction, something that would make it look like the hospital had given her the wrong drug. And it had worked. Mom had gone into anaphylactic shock. The doctors had tried to save her, but by the time they'd realized what was happening, it was too late. And everyone had assumed it was the hospital's error. Even Dr. Rodriguez had believed she'd somehow made a mistake, that she'd missed something in Mom's allergy history. David said the plan had been perfect, until Janet had started asking questions, until I'd started digging into things I should have left alone. I asked him how he could do this, how he could kill his own mother, how he could sit at her funeral and cry, how he could hold my hand and comfort me, how he could let an innocent doctor lose everything, how he could look at himself in the mirror. He said he didn't expect me to understand. He said he'd been backed into a corner. He said Mom was going to die eventually anyway. She had a heart condition. She might have had another year, maybe 2. He just moved up the timeline, and the insurance money would have set him up for life, would have set both of us up. I would have been taken care of. We could have both moved on. But now, because of Janet and because of my snooping, everything was ruined. He asked me what I was going to do. Was I going to turn him in? Was I going to destroy what was left of our family? I told him our family was already destroyed. He'd destroyed it the day he decided his mother's life was worth less than $500,000. I told him I was going to the police. I was going to tell them everything. I was going to make sure Dr. Rodriguez was exonerated. I was going to make sure Margaret got justice. David stared at me for a long moment. Then he stood up. He said he was disappointed in me. He said he'd thought I would understand, that I would put family first. He said if I went to the police, I would be throwing away my son's life. Was I really willing to do that? Was I really willing to lose both of them? I stood up too. I said I'd already lost him. The son I'd raised would never have done what he did. That person was gone. All that was left was a stranger who'd killed my wife and felt no remorse. David left without another word. He took the envelope with him. I let him go. I knew Janet had copies, and I knew what I had to do. I called the police that night. I told them everything. I gave them Janet's name and contact information. I told them about the forged prescription, the life insurance policy, the pharmacy records, everything David had confessed to me. They said they would investigate. They said they would be in touch. The next morning, I drove to Street Luke's hospital. I asked to speak to Dr. Elena Rodriguez. They told me she was no longer affiliated with the hospital due to the pending investigation. They gave me the contact information for her attorney. I called and left a message. I said I had information that would clear her name. I said I was sorry. I said I'd been manipulated by my son, and I was going to make it right. She called me back that afternoon. We met at a coffee shop near the hospital. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with dark hair and tired eyes. She thanked me for reaching out. She said the investigation had been destroying her life. She'd been suspended without pay. Other hospitals wouldn't hire her. Her colleagues avoided her. Her patients had lost trust in her. She'd been planning to move out of state, to start over somewhere else, where no one knew about the lawsuit. I told her what David had done. I showed her the copies of the records Janet had given me. I told her about his confession. I said I would testify on her behalf. I would make a statement to the hospital board. I would do whatever it took to clear her name. Dr. Rodriguez cried. She said she'd been questioning herself for months. She'd reviewed Margaret's case hundreds of times, trying to figure out what she'd missed. She'd been having nightmares about it. She'd started to doubt her own competence. And now, finding out there had been nothing she could have done, that it had been intentional sabotage, she didn't know whether to feel relieved or more horrified. I apologized to her. I said it wasn't enough, that words couldn't undo the damage I'd helped David cause. But I meant it. I was sorry. I'd been so consumed by grief and by my trust in my son that I couldn't see the truth. The police investigation moved quickly after that. With Janet's records and my statement and David's confession to me, they had enough to make an arrest. They picked David up 2 days later at his apartment. He was charged with first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and a list of other crimes I don't even remember. The district attorney said, if convicted, he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. The lawsuit against Dr. Rodriguez was dismissed. The hospital released a statement clearing her name and offered to reinstate her position. She declined. She said she couldn't work there anymore, not after everything that had happened. She took a position at a research hospital in Colorado instead. A fresh start. I withdrew David's claim on Margaret's life insurance. The insurance company launched their own investigation into the fraud. They denied the claim entirely. I didn't want the money anyway. The thought of it made me sick. David's trial was 6 months later. I testified against my son. I sat in that witness box and I told the jury everything. What David had confessed to me. How he'd planned it. How he'd executed it. How he'd let an innocent woman take the blame. I looked at him sitting at the defense table, and I didn't recognize him. He wasn't my son anymore. I don't know what he was. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. He was 35 years old. He would die in prison. David never apologized. Not to me, not to Dr. Rodriguez, not to anyone. He maintained that he'd been driven to it by circumstances beyond his control, that if I'd just supported him, just given him the money he needed, none of this would have happened, that it was everyone's fault but his own. I haven't seen him since the sentencing. He's written me letters from prison. I don't open them. I don't know what he could possibly say that would matter. Margaret's sister Claire came back to Phoenix after the trial. She stayed with me for a few weeks. She didn't say I told you so, but I could see it in her eyes. She'd sensed something was wrong with David. She'd tried to warn Margaret years ago that their son had problems, that his business failures and money troubles were symptoms of something deeper. But Margaret had defended him. She'd been his mother. She'd believed in him, and it had gotten her killed. I've had a lot of time to think about red flags I missed, about warning signs that were there all along. David had always been good at manipulating situations. Even as a kid, he could talk his way out of trouble. He was charming, convincing. He knew how to make people trust him. I'd thought it was confidence. I'd thought it was intelligence. I'd been proud of those qualities. I didn't see the lack of empathy underneath. The willingness to use people. The belief that he deserved whatever he wanted, regardless of the cost to others. Margaret had seen glimpses of it. She'd mentioned concerns over the years. But I'd dismissed them. I'd told her she was being too hard on him, that he would grow out of it, that he just needed time and support. I was wrong about everything. People ask me how I'm doing now. I tell them I'm managing. The truth is more complicated. I'm living in the house Margaret and I shared, surrounded by memories of her. I'm living with the knowledge that my son killed her and that I helped him almost get away with it. I'm living with the guilt of what I did to Dr. Rodriguez. I'm trying to understand how I could have been so blind. Janet from the pharmacy checks on me sometimes. She brings me meals, sits with me, lets me talk. She never says it was my fault. She says David was sick, that people like him are very good at hiding who they really are, that even trained professionals miss the signs sometimes. I appreciate her kindness, but I know the truth. I should have seen it. I was his father. If anyone should have known, it was me. I visited Margaret's grave last week. It was the first time I'd been back since the burial. I told her I was sorry. Sorry I couldn't protect her. Sorry I trusted the wrong person. Sorry I let her down in the worst way possible. I told her about David's conviction, about Dr. Rodriguez being cleared, about how justice had been served, even though it came too late for her. I don't know if she can hear me. I don't know if there's anything after death, but I needed to tell her anyway. I think about that morning a lot. The morning David insisted I stay home. The morning I was too tired to go with Margaret to the hospital. I wonder what would have happened if I'd insisted on going with them. Would David have gone through with it? Would he have found another way? Or would Margaret still be alive? I'll never know, and I have to live with that uncertainty for the rest of my life. The last time I spoke to David's defense attorney before the trial, he asked me if I was sure I wanted to testify. He said, as David's father, I could refuse. I could claim family privilege. I could stay silent and let the prosecution rely on other evidence. He said, testifying against my own son would haunt me forever. I told him I was already haunted. By Margaret's death, by my role in nearly destroying an innocent woman's life, by every choice I'd made that led to this moment. Testifying against David wouldn't add to that burden. It might be the only thing I could do to make any of it right. I don't regret that decision. I regret everything that came before it, but not that. I'm trying to move forward. I've started volunteering at a community center, teaching basic electrical skills to people who want to learn a trade. Margaret would have liked that. She always said I should share my knowledge, that I had so much to offer. I'm working with a therapist, trying to process the grief and the guilt and the betrayal. Some days are better than others. I've learned things about trust that I wish I didn't know. I've learned that the people closest to us are capable of the worst betrayals. I've learned that good people can enable bad people through love and loyalty. I've learned that when someone shows you who they really are, you need to believe them, even if it breaks your heart. Most of all, I've learned that justice matters, even when it costs you everything, even when it means turning in your own son, because the alternative is worse. The alternative is letting innocent people suffer. The alternative is being complicit in evil. Dr. Rodriguez sends me a card every year on the anniversary of Margaret's death. She thanks me for coming forward. She says she's doing well in Colorado, that she's found peace in her work. She says she doesn't blame me for what happened. I don't know if I believe her, but I appreciate the gesture. I still have the manila envelope Janet gave me, the one with all the prescription records and evidence. I keep it in a locked drawer in my bedroom. I don't look at it anymore, but I can't bring myself to throw it away. It's proof of what happened, proof of what my son did, proof of the worst moment of my life. Sometimes I wonder if David thinks about Margaret, if he has any regrets, if he realizes what he threw away. Not just her life, but everything. His freedom, his family, his future. All for money he never even got to spend. Money that wouldn't have fixed his problems anyway. You can't buy your way out of being the kind of person who would kill their own mother. I hope he thinks about her every day. I hope he sees her face when he closes his eyes. I hope the weight of what he did crushes him the way it's crushed me. But I don't think it does. I think David is still the same person he was. Still convinced he's the victim. Still unable to understand the magnitude of what he's done. And that might be the worst part of all. That my son became a monster. And he doesn't even know it. I was supposed to grow old with Margaret. We had plans. We were going to travel, maybe buy an RV and see the country. We were going to spend more time with grandchildren we'd never get to have now. We were going to sit on our porch in the evenings and watch the sun set over the desert. We were going to have more time. David took all of that from us, from me and from his mother. And he did it with careful calculation and no remorse. And I have to live with knowing that I raised someone capable of that. That somewhere along the way, despite everything Margaret and I tried to teach him, he learned that other people's lives don't matter as much as his own wants. I failed as a father. I failed as a husband. I failed as a human being. And there's no way to fix that. All I can do is try to be better. Try to see clearly. Try to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Even when it destroys what's left of my family. Margaret deserved better than the son we raised. She deserved better than the husband who couldn't protect her. She deserved to live. And the only thing I can do to honor her memory is to make sure her death meant something. To make sure David pays for what he did. To make sure Dr. Rodriguez got her life back. To make sure other people don't suffer because I was too cowardly or too blind to act. That's what I'm trying to do now. Every day. It's all I have left.